So before I begin, I just want to take an opportunity to thank Dr. Vanessa McCaffrey for nominating me to present my research at this year's Student Spotlight. And it really is an honor to be next to scholars like Noah Robertson and Lauren Bergeron. And it means a lot to me to have an opportunity to present my research despite what's going on in the world right now. So I just want to acknowledge that before I began. So my name is Scott Wistinghausen. I was raised in a rural farm community where men typically their masculinity was associated with things like athleticism, sexual prowess, or stoicism. And so this was me in high school. And you can imagine how I don't cleanly fit into necessarily any of those areas. And because of that, I was kind of excluded and I was ridiculed a lot throughout my youth and my adolescence. And just as an effort to fit in, I kind of adopted this submissive personality where I use self-deprecating humor to kind of fit in, and I would become the butt of the joke before anyone else could make me the butt of the joke. And this was mostly a defense mechanism, so that way I could find some acceptance in a group. And so just trying to prove my own manhood, my masculinity, I kind of gravitated towards things like athletics and specifically lacrosse. And so while I found minuscule success in it and I played college lacrosse here at Albion for a little bit, it was kind of a facade of my actual identity. It wasn't anything that I was really passionate about. It wasn't anything that I felt like it was truly me. And so being exposed to these things and still being ridiculed for kind of my androgynous personality, it kind of led me to isolate myself. And through this isolation, I mostly would do things like draw. And so after work and school, pretty much exclusively every day, I would sneak into the DIA and I would copy these master paintings and I would just try to hone the craft of drawing. I did this over and over and over, and these are just a few. And it was this practice that let me kind of communicate ideas more proficiently visually. And so I introduced paint to kind of bring color into it because color kind of has psychological effects on people where it can change the tone of what I'm working with. And so eventually I started to make work for other people other than myself. And so this is a drawing of my partner, Alex. And I actually gave her this drawing and she cried. And it was kind of the first time in my life that I ever had an emotional response from giving somebody a piece of artwork. And so from there, I kind of thought, well, if I can impact somebody else, how can I try to create a positive change in the world in addition to helping myself and the people closest to me? And so I kind of stumbled upon this idea of masculinity, vulnerability, and myself reaching an understanding with where I fit in with all this. For so much of my life, I was insecure about masculinity, and to this day, I still have some insecurities about it. And for a long time, I was absolutely mortified to be vulnerable. And so I kind of began this process by doing these crude drawings that were titled after things that I had been called in my youth and adolescence. So things like pansy, twinkle toes, there were these kind of soft jabs that were comically thrown at me and my peers as a way to kind of passively emasculate people. And once I kind of started thinking about this more and more every day, I eventually applied for the FIRSCA grant, which allowed me a summer fellowship. And this really got the ball rolling in this whole body of work because it allowed me time, space, and mentorship to create this small series of works. And so I started working with Professor Michael Dixon, and he kind of challenged me to actually become more vulnerable because despite trying to speak about vulnerability in my work, I myself was failing to be vulnerable. So it was inauthentic in a sense. And so my response to that was I dressed up as a baby and I pretended to sleep outside of the Penland School of Crafts cafeteria. And this was really a statement to me about naivety, about how this baby believes that no one's going to cut him. And it's a statement about naivety, and it was really a way for me to push my social norms. So from there, the body of work, really what started it was me reading the writings of Albion College's Scott Meltzer and C.J. Pascoe. And C.J. Pascoe coined this term, the fag discourse, in her informative text, Dude, You're a Fag. And so this term essentially means that men are constantly in a state of being emasculated anytime somebody calls them a fag or pansy, twinkle toes, things like this. And so we adopt toxic behavior to kind of combat the fag discourse. And when you look at that in comparison to Scott Meltzer's Manhood Impossible, who he basically theorizes that manhood is impossible to reach, it makes sense because when we apply the fag discourse to manhood, you're constantly being ripped out of your manhood by being questioned and emasculated. And so it kind of begs this question of why do we even bother reaching manhood? And so this is kind of where performative masculinity, more specifically toxic masculinity, comes into play. because men are constantly being emasculated by each other, we perform toxic masculinity as a way to kind of assert our dominance, our manhood, and our control. And so I was going back to the idea of naivety and this idea of toxic masculinity. I kind of adopted this idea of rape culture and how naivety kind of enforces that by saying boys will be boys, or we address it as locker room talk. It really is reinforcing and enforcing a rape culture all in one. And so this kind of became the start of the work. And so I kind of thought about my own life and how I've been naive at times and possible times that I have made someone uncomfortable. And I started this smaller body of work within this larger body of work as a way to address this. And so all the titles of these couple paintings are supposed to be as if a child is reading a run-on paragraph. So it's, and I hope you love me enough to stay because I could never watch you leave. But please remember, I never wanted you to feel this way. And now we remember by trying to forget. And this is really kind of my way to address this. And so after thinking about that, I was thinking about Stoicism, because the reason I used this Raggedy Ann doll was because she's a stoic figure. Despite smiling all the time, Raggedy Ann can't cry, she can't laugh, she can't tell you she's upset, she can't tell you you did something wrong. And so she really became a perfect symbol for Stoicism. And through there, I kind of thought about my own Stoicism. And so I did this piece that kind of reflected on my childhood of me trying to become friends with a person. And despite how badly I wanted to be friends with him, in hindsight, this kid really didn't like me. I sat next to him in math class, and his reciprocation of the friendship I tried to show him was he would sharpen 2 to 3 pencils every single day before class, and he would stick me in the side with them because I sat next to him in this math class. And these drew blood, and there were these small punctures that I had to hide from my parents. And so the reason why I have this towel over my chest like this is because I walked around my house with this towel over my chest like this for a month so I could hide these cuts from my parents, because I was both scared and embarrassed to explain to them what happened. And so this was kind of my first encounter with Stoicism, and it was kind of a loss of innocence for me too, because it was the first time in my life I realized, like, not everyone wants to help you, not everyone wants to be your friend, and I had to kind of come to terms with that. And since then I have really come to terms with that. And so continuing on this idea of loss of innocence, I started to think about these hero stories we tell in our culture, like David and Goliath. We see it as this coming of age story, this birth of a hero story, but really, if you just look at it scene for scene, it's kind of a loss of innocence story. So in this kind of idea, I put myself in David's shoes, because he's really kind of being pressured by his society and his culture and the masculine behavior of protecting the so-called masculine behavior, and he's committing a gruesome murder. And so if you can picture yourself being put in that situation, how traumatizing that would actually be, it can be incredibly difficult. And so that's what I did. And kind of the troubling part about all of this is, despite the dialogue I'm trying to open and kind of the cultural shift I'm trying to push on people and the social commentary, people think that all this work is about me and I only care about myself. That's why I paint myself all the time. You're a narcissist. Self-portraiture is all about you. It's you. And, that upsets me, because it's not about that. The main reason I use self-portraiture, one, is because, yes, it is partly my story. And two, I don't have to hire models. I imagine paying someone to pose like this. And so that's why I use self-portraiture. And so, but after hearing this narcissism talk, I kind of leaned into the work and I kind of made the work about me, because I hadn't really truly done it for me for a long time. And so I adopted this alter ego, Mowgli, which was a pet name my mom called me all throughout my youth and to this day. And I realized this could be some form of appropriation with the Jungle Book, but in reality, Mowgli is just a piece of my childhood, and that's why I used the name. And so Mowgli became this alter ego who essentially epitomizes everything I'm not. He's outlandish, he's abrasive, he's arrogant, he's everything I'm not. And so it became a way for me to become very demonstrative and emotional in my work. And it also became a way for me to reflect on things and kind of challenge people and make them a little bit uncomfortable, which was something I was scared to do for a long time. And so by making other people uncomfortable, it kind of made me become more comfortable, and it let me get more experimental with the work. And at the same time, it kind of made me think about my own identity and where I was. When we think about these masculine things that men are kind of expected to do, one of the things is breadwinning. And as an artist, it's incredibly hard to be the breadwinner and kind of go on this dream of being an artist. And so the further and further I went down this artist pit, I kind of realized like I'm falling further and further away from that idea of manhood and masculinity, and I was losing what I guess I thought I was supposed to be. And I'm coming to terms with that now. I'm kind of trying to move through that. And just being associated with things like Greek life and college sports and all these masculine activities that we do that tend to have toxic environments. I thought about these men who try to impress each other by drinking copious amounts of alcohol to the point where men and boys are dying very often in Greek life and in athletics because they're trying to prove their masculinity in a toxic way by drinking. And I kind of reflected on this and thought about this, and I pictured myself like, what if I didn't make it through college, Greek life, or sports because I was just trying to impress people with drinking or something stupid, doing some stunt? And what if a hospital had to call my mom in the middle of the night and they had to tell her that Mowgli's barely breathing? And so this was kind of an informal apology to my mom for all the mistakes that I've made in my life where I've worried her. And that kind of just made me think about all the mistakes I've made in general. And so I don't want to play the victim and say that everything that's ever happened, I'm not asking for people to feel bad for me. I really am just trying to forgive myself and forgive other people for what happened, because I truly do believe that hurt people hurt people. And so for every time somebody ever took a piece of me, oftentimes I would lash out and hurt somebody else. So I made this piece specifically because I want people to know that if they feel empty, if they feel like they need something to fill them, some reverence, that they can have a piece of me, because it's very, very likely that I don't deserve all my pieces. And so I would just like to thank Michael Dixon, Ann McCauley, Lynn Chatello, Ashley Fagan, Emmeline Solomon, Dr. Billy Wickery, Dr. Nancy Demernash, Jessica Merrill, Paige Rumler, Dr. Vanessa McCaffrey, and Renee Krager, who are the people that I mostly dealt with in FIRSCA. And I'd like to thank my parents for teaching me what a man should be and also what he doesn't have to be. These are my sources cited. And I just want to thank everyone again for listening. And I just want to say thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Just want everyone to know that I'm thankful that they heard this, and I want everyone to be safe and have a great night. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Today I will be sharing my research that I completed during the summer of 2019 through FIRSCA. The title of my research is This Insolent and Inhuman Race, White Union Soldiers' Thoughts About White Southerners During the Civil War Era. A little backstory to how my project came about. I started my freshman year participating in the Student Research Partners Program through FIRSCA, where I was working directly under Dr. Sachs and her research project. And after fall semester, Dr. Sachs reached out to me and asked me if I was interested in doing summer research with her. And of course I said yes. I began my summer research under her research question, which related to white Union soldiers' racial attitudes towards African Americans during the Civil War. However, after I began working with the material a little bit, I was finding a lot of interesting comments about made by white Union soldiers about white Southerners, and with that, I shifted my research focus. So my new research question became, what were ordinary white Union soldiers' attitudes towards white Southerners during the Civil War? The methods to completing my research were pretty straightforward. I started by evaluating my sources. So because I did not have unlimited amount of time to read unlimited amounts of diaries, I had to try to find as many information-rich diaries as possible. I did this by looking at the descriptions and the tags created by archivists and librarians that maybe indicate what the diary was about. That way I could find diaries that had, or were most likely to have information that were related to my research question. Then I would read the diaries. I read for hours and hours. That was the bulk of my entire research experience, was just reading diaries. Sometimes I'd be lucky enough to get a typed manuscript, which was great. And other times I would be reading absolutely terrible handwriting for just hours trying to figure out what it was saying. But the diaries I read and collected my research from were split between online published diaries, mostly at the University of Iowa's online archive, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and at the Library of Congress in person in their manuscript divisions. And then my last step was transcribing. Rather than transcribing entire diaries, I would just transcribe passages that related to my research question. I would type them into a Google Doc, making sure to pay special attention to where the diary is from. That way I can give credit to it later, like Library of Congress, Massachusetts Historical Society, but also the author of the diary, the date when the passage was pulled from, and then like if location is available, that as well. So to the right is just a picture of kind of what this process looks like. This diary is an example of kind of a neater handwriting. But I would take that passage that related to my topic and just type into a Google Doc and save that for later when I was uh, coming to my conclusions and collecting everything. And then some examples of what I found and what the material I was looking at looks something like this. So on the far left, upper left, there's a picture of a diary. That one again is a little bit of a neater handwritten written one. But at times I would be looking at diaries where it was just like lines. You could barely tell if there were actual letters on the page. Sometimes I would get newspaper clippings that had annotations and drawings on them. And again, sometimes I would be lucky enough to get a manuscript that was already typed up, which was easy breezy. Sometimes I was lucky enough to come across pictures of the soldiers, which was really neat to see kind of put a face to the information I was reading. I was reading these people's personal diaries, so sometimes it was really nice to be able to see their faces. And sometimes I would find like flowers and plants and stuff left in the diaries. So I split my research into 3 different categories. The first category being white Union soldiers' thoughts about rich slave-owning white Southerners. So obviously the biggest pull away from this was that white Union soldiers resented the elite Southerners for seceding and starting the war. There was not necessarily as many comments made about rich slave-owning white Southerners, just because many of them had already abandoned their plantations or were fighting in the war. So the white Union soldiers were not necessarily encountering them as they moved through the South. However, it was clear that the white Union soldiers recognized the war was started by the rich slave-owning white Southerners, and again, resented them for that. The next category I split it into were their thoughts about poor white Southerners. So the thing that surprised me most about what I was finding was I was finding a lot more comments that were sociological observations rather than political. There were many comments on lack of education, poor hygiene, poor living conditions in general. And some white Union soldiers disdained these poor whites for supporting a cause that did not belong to them. The white Union soldiers recognized that poor whites had nothing to gain, not necessarily the most to gain, in supporting the institution of slavery. And because of that, white Union soldiers disdained poor whites. Some examples of comments below of what I was finding. The first comment really stood out to me, mostly because it was made by a white woman who was working as a doctor for the Union soldiers, which was not common at all. It was not common to come across a woman that participated in the war in this way. But she said, there are also many of the poor whites who are in even more desperate conditions. These Florida crackers are much less human than the blacks, more ignorant, dirty, and lifeless. Many of them look as if they had already been buried for months. Their hair and skin and dirty, faded butternut clothes look all of a piece. Even the blacks have great contempt for them. So I was coming across a lot of comments like that, which I found really interesting. The final category that I split my research into were white Union soldiers' thoughts about white Southern women. This was definitely the most surprising to me and most interesting. And one of the reasons why there were so many comments made about the women is because besides African Americans, the Southern women were some of the only ones left in the South and the only people that the Union soldiers were coming across as they moved through. So there were many comments on appearance. Many found that the women were the most bitter and disgruntled. White Union soldiers would go through town and the women would be fanning themselves with Confederate flags and that kind of thing. And there was a huge emphasis on women being unladylike and problematic. This included things like the women spitting in their faces, chewing tobacco, that kind of thing. So there are some examples of comments below, but I kind of wanted to draw your attention to the cartoon on the right. So although I spent a majority of my research time at the Library of Congress in the manuscript division, I was lucky enough to spend some time in the prints and photographs division and look through some old photographs and magazines from the Civil War era. I came across this comic and I thought it related a lot to what I was finding. So it depicts before and after General Butler's order was put in place, and basically General Butler's order prevented local women from insulting U.S. soldiers. So the first slide of the comic on the left shows the woman spitting in a Union soldier's face. They're both portrayed as ugly and unladylike. They're spitting in their faces, but after the order was put in place on the right side, they're depicted as like beautiful women, and the Union soldier's even tipping his hat to the women as he goes through. So I thought that was really interesting. And then just some discussion about what this means, and what I was thinking about as I was finding this information. The white Union soldiers going into the South, they discovered that it had a completely different culture than the North, and they talked about it as if it was a foreign country. And some white Union soldiers went as far as to call the poor whites a completely separate race. They would talk about them as if they were completely different from themselves. And in the end, a lot of them came to the realization that the North and South were culturally incompatible. Politically, socially, economically, they were completely separate. And the white Union soldiers entering the South really gained a better understanding of that as they were experiencing it. And then the comment on this page I thought was just a little funny sketch that a soldier made in his diary. The first part says secession first. It's spelled incorrectly, but I think it's to make the joke work. And then the second one is a man on his back, and it says less in second. So I thought that was kind of fun. But the overall significance of my findings and the conclusion I came to was, while originally fighting the war to reunite the Union, the comments made by white Union soldiers towards these white Southerners suggest that the Union was never truly united to begin with. These soldiers were going down with the idea that the only thing separating them from the South was the institution of slavery. However, again, once they got down there and was interacting with these white Southerners, they realized just how truly different they were. Just some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Dr. Sachs and the Albion College History Department, Dr. Sachs for being my faculty mentor and giving me so much support and encouragement throughout this project and really helping me develop it. Destiny Stiles was the other first student I did my project alongside. It was really nice to have someone else to bounce ideas off of and go through these new experiences with, like learning how to do research in an archive and navigating in new cities. Renee Krieger, Dr. McCaffrey, and the FERSCA committee for funding my project, and the Great Lakes College Association, and the librarians at the Library of Congress for helping us while we were at the Library of Congress, but also the GLCA for funding the Library of Congress research initiative, which I was able to go to Library of Congress through. And any questions? Thank you guys so much for watching.